So friends, as you are already well aware, Donald Trump is having his Department of Justice vindictively prosecute former FBI Director James Comey. And to that end, Trump had his former personal attorney and insurance lawyer, Lindsey Halligan, go into the grand jury and indict Comey. And Comey's lawyers, predictably, filed several motions to dismiss the indictment, including challenging what Lindsey Halligan did in the grand jury. And so the judge told Lindsey Halligan to provide the evidence to her, to the judge, of what she did in the grand jury to obtain this indictment. But surprise, surprise, Lindsey Halligan failed to give the judge what the judge requested, what the judge ordered her to produce. And now the judge has called her out on it. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, this one is quite a story. So together, let's wade through this particular pile of Trump flunky garbage. And it's going to take me a few minutes to sort of lay this one out. So please bear with me. But let's start by setting it up with this reporting from the New York Times. Headline: Comey attacks perjury and obstruction charges in new motions. And that article reads in part: in their second motion filed by Comey's defense lawyers, the lawyers homed in on Ms. Halligan herself, a former personal lawyer to Mr. Trump, who was handling her first criminal case when she appeared in front of the grand jury seeking to indict Mr. Comey. Ms. Halligan, they added, is a former insurance lawyer who lacks any prosecutorial experience. Substantively, the lawyers accuse Ms. Halligan of committing irregularities so severe and pervasive in front of the grand jury that they likely prejudiced the grand jurors' narrow decision to indict. They reminded Judge Nachmanoff, the presiding judge, of some of her rookie errors, pointing out how she had kept the grand jurors in the courthouse well past normal business hours after they failed to endorse one of the 3 original counts she was seeking. The lawyers also noted that Ms. Halligan had confusingly signed 2 different versions of the indictment. As further evidence that the grand jury process was potentially tainted, the lawyers said that the FBI agent who testified to the grand jurors might have improperly shared privileged communications between Mr. Comey and one of his lawyers. Quote, all available evidence regarding Ms. Halligan's first ever grand jury presentation smacks of irregularity, the lawyers wrote. It is virtually unheard of for a brand new prosecutor to make her first grand jury presentation alone, without the supervision and guidance of an experienced prosecutor to ensure the absence of factual and legal errors. The prosecutors handling the case were brought in from North Carolina after Ms. Halligan was unable to find anyone in the Eastern District of Virginia to do the job. A hearing has been set for November 13 to consider the challenge to Ms. Halligan's appointment. It will be heard by a visiting judge from South Carolina, Cameron McGowan Curry, who has agreed to combine Mr. Comey's attack on the appointment with that from another Trump adversary charged by Ms. Halligan, Letitia James, the New York Attorney General. And friends, can I just add a quick footnote here? Do you know how unusual, how unprecedented it's going to be when this hearing is conducted by that visiting judge from South Carolina, Judge Curry. We're going to have not one, but two defendants sitting in the same criminal courtroom, even though they have their own separate cases. And who are those two defendants? One is the former director of the FBI, and the other, who is also being vindictively prosecuted by the Trump administration, is the current New York State Attorney General, and they are both attacking the allegedly unlawful appointment of a former insurance lawyer and Trump flunky, Lindsey Halligan, for what she did by going into the grand jury and obtaining these two vindictive indictments. Yes, those are unprecedented circumstances. But now let's continue on in the coverage of this story and see what Judge Curry just said regarding Lindsey Halligan not really fully complying with the judge's order. This from a publication called Notice, News of the United States. Headline: Judge demands to see more evidence on prosecutor Lindsey Halligan's handling of Comey case. A federal judge said Halligan must turn over a full transcript of grand jury indictment proceedings, including the prosecutor's own statements. The federal prosecutor overseeing the criminal case against former FBI Director James Comey turned over only a partial transcript of grand jury indictment proceedings to a judge that did not include what she, Halligan, had said in front of grand jurors. U.S. District Judge Cameron McGowan Curry called out the prosecutor, Lindsey Halligan, for the partial transcript in an order on Tuesday and demanded she submit the whole thing as requested. It's the latest indication that the judge is closely examining the conduct of the politically appointed acting U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, who is fighting off a bid by Comey's legal team to disqualify her from the case. Halligan, who was appointed with the expectation that she would indict the president's political enemies, was expected to privately submit the transcript so the judge could review the way she presented the case, seeking to criminally charge Comey. But when she, Halligan, did, it only included testimony from a witness and not her own comments, according to the judge's order. Judge Curry is overseeing Comey's team's attempt to deem Halligan's appointment as unlawful, but not overseeing the criminal trial. She, Judge Curry, gave prosecutors until Wednesday afternoon to turn over all the paperwork or audio recordings. Okay, friends, so now let's turn to Judge Curry's very short one-page order. In the case of United States of America versus James B. Comey, Jr., defendant, order. Defendant James Comey has filed a motion to dismiss, alleging the indictment resulted from a violation of the Appointments Clause, which authorizes appointment of an interim United States attorney. On October 28, 2025, the undersigned, meaning the judge, entered an order directing the government, the Department of Justice, Lindsey Halligan, to submit for in-camera review, which means private review in the judge's chambers, all documents relating to the indictment signer's participation in the grand jury proceedings, along with the complete grand jury transcripts. And the indictment signer in this case is Lindsey Halligan. On Friday, October 31st, 2025, the court received a package containing, inter alia, among other things, a transcript of grand jury proceedings on September 25, 2025. This court has reviewed the transcript and finds it fails to include remarks made by the indictment signer, Halligan, both before and after the testimony of the sole witness. which remarks were referenced by the indictment signer during the witness's testimony. In addition, the packet contains no records or transcripts regarding the presentation of the 3-count indictment referenced in the transcript of the return of grand jury indictment proceedings before the magistrate judge. Accordingly, the government, DOJ, Lindsey Halligan, is directed to submit no later than Wednesday, November 5th, 2025 at 5 p.m. for in-camera review, a complete transcript and or recording of all statements made by Halligan, the indictment signer, to the grand jury on September 25th, 2025, to include statements made prior to and after the testimony of the witness and during the presentation of the 3-count and subsequent 2-count indictments. It is so ordered. Signed, Cameron McGowan Curry, Senior United States District Judge. Okay, friends, now I want to translate the judge's order from legalese into English, and I'm going to do that in a minute. But first, let me tell you how the grand jury works. As a career federal prosecutor, I spent decades going in and out of the grand jury, making presentations, arguing to the grand jury about what the evidence means and why I believe there was probable cause to return an indictment against the target of the grand jury investigation. But before I ever set foot in a grand jury, when I joined the Department of Justice, we had so much training, something like 6 to 8 weeks of basic training, so we would know what the job of a federal prosecutor involved. And then we had training specifically on grand jury procedures, the do's, the don'ts, the ins, the outs, the legalities, the constitutionality of what we did in the grand jury. And then we would go into the grand jury and sit quietly like a potted plant in the corner while experienced grand jury prosecutors made presentations to the grand jury. We were trained, and then we went in there and we listened and we learned. And then when we first went in to present our own case to the grand jury, we had a fellow prosecutor who was a supervisor making sure we did it right. This is not to be trifled with. The grand jury process. It is sacred. The grand jury sits as the conscience of the community, in part as a check, as a guardrail against prosecutorial abuse and overreach and misconduct. What did Lindsey Halligan do? Well, first of all, there was a career prosecutor named Eric Siebert at the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office. In fact, not only had he been a prosecutor in that office since 2010, Donald Trump selected him to be the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. But when he concluded that they didn't have evidence to indict James Comey for a crime, Donald Trump, who was hell-bent on making sure somebody that he, Trump, perceived as an enemy, one of Donald Trump's critics, somebody who had called out Donald Trump's lawlessness, would be prosecuted, that he pulled Eric Siebert out of the job. He took his former personal lawyer, who was like a White House aide at the time, and her only experience was she worked in insurance law, apparently. You know what? I want somebody to adjudicate a fender bender. Maybe Lindsey Halligan is the right choice. But he took her, made her U.S. attorney, unlawfully, it appears. And virtually the next day, somebody tells her, go into the grand jury and indict James Comey. And I can tell you, I can't imagine she knew what the hell she was doing in there. But she had her marching orders to go into the grand jury and obtain the vindictive indictment that dear leader wanted. The judge needed to see what Halligan did in there to assess whether James Comey's motion to dismiss for irregularity and illegality and perhaps unconstitutionality in the grand jury should result in the indictment being thrown out and in the case being dismissed. So the judge told Halligan, the DOJ, produce everything that went on in the grand jury. And what did Halligan do? She apparently only produced the transcript of the testimony of one witness before the grand jury. Nothing that she said before, during, after. Here's the thing, friends. When you walk into a grand jury room, the minute that door closes to that windowless room, the grand jury reporter, think court reporter, will start recording the proceedings. You don't even breathe heavy as a prosecutor before the grand jury reporter is recording everything that is going on in that room. And you sure don't start talking about the case or the evidence to the grand jurors unless and until it is on the record, being audio recorded and being taken down by the grand jury reporter, who is like a stenographer, taking everything down like they do in court, the court reporters. But she didn't give that to the judge, even though the judge asked for all of it. So the judge just issued this order saying, look, I told you once to turn all this over. I'm not going to tell you again beyond this court order, which says by Wednesday, I want it all. So I can assess whether this is a legitimate or illegitimate indictment based on what you did before that grand jury. So friends, hold on tight, because when we see how Lindsey Halligan went about extracting this vindictive indictment from a grand jury under those screwy circumstances that are partially described in the reporting and in the judge's court order, there are multiple indictments coming out. They're both signed, but they conflict with one another. You know, I think when we see what she did in there, this case is going to fail spectacularly. And we are very likely to see a judge order the case dismissed, probably with prejudice, which means the case is dead forever and it can never be rebrought. And friends, I have a feeling that when and if this case fails spectacularly, Lindsey Halligan, Pam Bondi, and Donald Trump go down in flames in their zeal to vindictively prosecute people who Donald Trump perceives as enemies or critics, opponents, or foes. I have a feeling when this one fails, it will be the first of many prosecutions, vindictive prosecutions, brought by Donald Trump and Pam Bondi, that will fail. And each time Donald Trump and Pam Bondi's Department of Justice fails to successfully prosecute someone Trump perceives as an enemy, Donald Trump will get weaker and weaker and weaker. It will expose him as the paper tiger that he really is, because he can threaten to prosecute anybody and everybody, but he can't follow through. He can't do it successfully. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.